Howdy my totally as always, Tubular Gamers, we're back with you guessed it, another video. Now you ever play a game and you're like, yeah, this is pretty decent, this is pretty alright, and you look online and people just seem to absolutely hate it, they just trash it left and right? Well, that's what today's video is all about, overhated games.
Yes, today we are looking at overhated video games. While not everybody's going to like every single game, and some games absolutely deserve hate, these are 10 games that in my opinion have gotten so much hate over the years, and looking back, these games really don't deserve as much hate as they got. Sure, they might not be good or great games, they might even be the weakest in their series, but to be as hated and disliked as they are, well, I think it's a little ridiculous. All of this, of course, is just my opinion. This list is in no particular order, and this is based off the circles I'm in, and just how I see general reception for these games. I could be completely wrong, and maybe these games aren't overhated, or yeah, they very well could be deserving of the hate. There very well could be some nice hot and spicy takes here, but again, I'm just here to share my general opinion, and I'm not going to hate on a game or pick a game for this list just because it's a console exclusive. I think that's just silly. You gotta let me know down below if you agree with this list, or if you disagree and you think the hate is well warranted. Either way, let me know how you're feeling down below. I always love reading the comments and lurking down there, so please like, share, comment, subscribe. I got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly, and I mean truly, greatly appreciated. Seriously, thank you all very much. Every single one of you that watches my videos, I really do appreciate you. So let's get on to it, but before we begin, I do want to give an honorable mention to Days Gone. A lot of people really did not like this game when it initially came out, but over the years I feel like this game has made a complete 180, and a majority of people are saying that it is underrated these days. I don't think this game is as overhated as it used to be, at least in my general circles, but Days Gone gets an honorable mention. Alright, on to the real first game. Now, when I was thinking of overhated video games, the game that immediately comes to mind is DMC Devil May Cry. That's the Devil May Cry reboot that came out in 2013. It's hard to believe that this game came out over 10 years ago, but from the moment it was announced, people have been hating on it and shitting on it and just dunking on it, and I think it's gotten to a point where, yeah, this game really is overhated. Now, don't get it twisted, I think this game does have some issues, and I much would rather see the mainline Devil May Cry series continue, but I'm not going to sit here and act like this is a terrible game, or it ruined the series, or that it is very few redeemable qualities. I actually think that this is a pretty solid character action game. Yes, it's not in the mainline series, and it has a very different Dante, not only visually but personality wise, and it's not as good as the main series. Dante not only looks incredibly edgy, but his personality just isn't really all that great. It's incredibly juvenile, even for Dante, and it feeds into a larger issue that the narrative, dialogue, and story in general just aren't very good. It's easily this game's biggest issue, and I can see why so many people had problems with it. However, I'm willing to look past a subpar story if the gameplay is good, and I think the gameplay is actually good. It doesn't have the depth of the mainline Devil May Cry series. This is not comparable to Devil May Cry 4 or 5. And there's no styles, and Dante doesn't have this just absolute behemoth of a moveset, but again, I still think it's a decent character action game. There is some depth here, you can actually do some cool shit, and there's a decent moveset. You can string together some pretty amazing combos here, and I think the combat in general is actually way better than people give it credit for. Something else that I think is good that not enough people give it credit for is the level design. I actually really enjoy the level design, not only visually, but I just enjoy going through these levels. Like, they look really cool. They all feel distinct from each other, and there's a decent amount of variety here, even with the weird platforming. I think the general pacing of the game is good. There's some pretty awesome boss fights, you get into plenty of good enemy encounters, and again, Dante's moveset is fun to play with. It's not all perfect though. Like I said, there's not as much depth as the main games. If you expect to be switching between the styles and doing these just absolutely insane combos, you won't find it here. There's also some enemies that can only be hit with a certain type of move, where you need to hit them with an angelic move or a demonic move. I've always thought this is kind of stupid, and that initial release didn't let you lock onto enemies, which was a bit weird, but none of these are gargantuan issues, and I still think the game is actually very good. It's also not the last Devil May Cry game. We did get Devil May Cry 5, which did continue the series and show that this reboot really was just a one-off, and it's because of that the game is a lot easier to like. It's not the last Devil May Cry game, it didn't kill off the series or anything like that. It's still going strong, and I think people should cut it some slack. There's no reason to hate on it as much as people did for so long. I mean, I really do think it's a good game, and it's probably better than you remember, except the cutscenes. Those are as bad as you remember. And so yeah, I know I'm potentially starting with a really hot take, but hey, go big or go home, I guess. And our next game is Dark Souls 2. Now, I've been seeing people dunk on this game for years now, for like 10 years now, and I've seen a lot of people call it the worst of the Dark Souls series, the worst Souls game From Software's ever made, and I really do disagree on this one. Maybe it's just a smoking hot take, but I don't think this is the weakest game from Software. I think it's still actually quite good. It's not as good as Dark Souls 1 and 3, I will immediately say that. And it totally has some issues, but the amount of hate I've seen this game get is a bit ridiculous. Like, even when this game is at its absolute worst, it's still a great game in my opinion. And the good really does outweigh the bad significantly. Like, yeah, the bosses in this game aren't all that great. A lot of them are just a dude. And I'll concede and say that a majority of them are underwhelming, but they're not all terrible. There still are some good boss fights here. The level design is not as strong as Dark Souls 1 and 3's, but I still think there's some really good levels here. I think the PvP is way better than what people give it credit for. And some things like the RPG side of things and how the stats work are certainly a bit questionable at times, but it's nothing major. It doesn't really hamper the experience that much. I mean, maybe it does for you, but to me at least, I found most of them as minor issues. My biggest issue really was the bosses, just because I thought there were so many amazing bosses in the first and third game that the second game, yeah, it really just doesn't compare. That and a few of the areas are just kinda shite, and the game is really linear, and I loved how non-linear the first game was. But despite this, I've played through the game twice, I've played all the DLC, and the DLC, yeah, it's probably the weakest DLC From Software's made, but I still thought it was pretty decent. I mean, that Fume Knight boss fight, I mean, that might be better than like all the bosses in the main game. That was actually pretty good. I know I've been a bit back and forth while describing this game, but I really do think it's a good game. I've heard plenty of people say that they think Dark Souls 2 is a bad game, and I really just don't understand that one. Even with all of the game's issues, I would still rather play this over Demon Souls. Like, maybe I'm just overlooking all of the game's issues or something, but I've always thought Dark Souls 2 was a bit overhated. Again, it's not as good as several other of the Souls games. I'd much rather play Dark Souls 1, 3, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, and their respective DLCs, but man, this is still a good game. I have no problem still recommending it, and when I hear people say Dark Souls 2 is some ass, I disagree. I really do disagree there. I think that it has a ton of great qualities, like it does have some excellent level design, some great areas, some good boss fights, the combat's still solid. Again, the PvP is way better than you probably remember, and it's got a good length to it. It took me even longer than the first game did. I recommend Dark Souls 2. I don't think that it deserves as much hate as it gets, and I still like the game. Alright, so for this entry, I have not one game, but a few games in the same series, and that series is Final Fantasy. Now, at this point, Final Fantasy is a very divisive series, and you'll find people hating on pretty much every game. Outside of like Final Fantasy VI, every Final Fantasy game has its haters, but when it comes to the Final Fantasy games that I think are overhated, I have Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy XV. I believe these two are the most overhated in the series. Now, Final Fantasy VIII has been disliked for 25 plus years at this point, and as a follow-up to the much beloved Final Fantasy VII, yes, it is a disappointment, but I still think it's a great game and it has plenty of merit. Like, to just throw away and ignore 8 because, oh, it's nowhere near as good as 7, I think you're really doing a disservice to the game. I think Final Fantasy VIII is still a great RPG, but I'm not going to sit here and glaze the game for 5 minutes straight. Final Fantasy VIII, it does have some issues. The whole junction system, the whole GF system, it's overcomplicated, it was too ambitious for the time, and coming back to it is a bit tricky. The game does a very poor job of explaining it to you, and there's a good chance you might have to look up how exactly it works or how to best optimize your strategies. I certainly did, and I'm not afraid to admit it because, yeah, the game just doesn't really explain it all that well, but once you understand how it actually works, it's a decent system. I know the story's always been a point of contention for people, but I really enjoy the story and world of Final Fantasy VIII. I actually like Squall, I like the love story, and I think the atmosphere is great in this game. The music is also fantastic. Despite all the hate this game gets, I never see anybody shit on the music. Everybody knows the music is pretty much goated in this game. I think the presentation is actually just very good. I think the battle mechanics are solid, the pacing is very good in this game, there's a ton of memorable, likable characters, and it kept me thoroughly engaged. But I know people just couldn't get past the junction system or Squall, and the game's somewhat slower intro, and that's a shame because I really do think Final Fantasy VIII, while it's not one of the very best games in the series, I still think it's pretty good. And then we have Final Fantasy 15. This game has kind of been all over the place when it comes to general reception. I've heard some people say they absolutely love this game, and I've heard some people say this is the worst Final Fantasy game since the second one, and nobody should play it at all, and it's an awful game. And I fall onto the side that thinks the game is still pretty good. I will admit, this game has some serious issues, especially when it comes to the pacing. The last few chapters are not very good. The game is super linear. The story feels like it comes to a screeching halt and isn't very enjoyable, and it feels like everything that was great about the game's first few chapters is just completely gone. And sure, Square added some updates, they added some side missions or whatever, but the last few chapters just aren't very good. However, I'd say like the first 60 to 70% of the game is great. The open world is great. I love driving around in the car. The side content's excellent. There's so much to do in this game, like going on all the hunts, doing all the cooking. I think the combat's actually pretty good. It's not as good as like Final Fantasy 16, but I think the combat's good. I love going around with Noctis and the boys, and I think the story's pretty decent to good here. This game also has some pretty awesome boss fights. There's some really good set pieces, and it's really a spectacle. And despite the last few chapters not being very good, I think the game actually has a great final chapter and a really powerful ending. The music and presentation are top notch, there's a lot of fan service here, the fishing minigame really slaps, and I really did still enjoy my time with it. I can see why some people don't like it, but I don't think it's one of the worst Final Fantasy games. I've seen people do 2 or 3 hour long analysis as to why this game sucks, and I'm not going to sit here and do that. I'm just going to say that I enjoy the game, and at this point I think the game is a bit overhated. So from one RPG to the next, here we have Mass Effect 3. It's pretty obvious where I'm going to go with this, so I'm just going to address the elephant in the room, the ending. Yeah, the ending is not the best. I very much remember when the game came out and everyone was lambasting the ending, and then they even added the DLC to try to help with it, but it really doesn't help with it. The ending just isn't very good no matter how you slice it. However, I truly believe that if you look past the ending, you have a great game here. The intro is fantastic, the middle's great, the climax is great, literally everything is good up until like the last cutscene. I'd say 90-95% of the game's story, pacing, progression is awesome, and if you got a 95% on a test, you'd still get an A. I think Mass Effect 3 is still an excellent game that people really discount because of the lackluster ending. I will concede and say that it's not as good as Mass Effect 2. I think Mass Effect 2 is the overall stronger game, and it's not just because Mass Effect 2 has a better ending. I think the game has better pacing and characters, but Mass Effect 3 has a really solid roster of companions. The combat is easily the best of the trilogy. I like the planets you go to. I like how a bunch of plot points and choices carry over from even the original game. That's pretty awesome, and they do have a little bit of an effect on what happens in the game. And I very much think that if you go into this game with the expectation of the ending just being, yeah, not so great, I think you're going to enjoy the game more. Obviously, you couldn't have known that back when the game first came out, but now we have the privilege of hindsight. The game's even been re-released on the PS4 and modern consoles, and so yeah, if you're going to play this game nowadays, know the ending isn't the best, enjoy the rest of the game. I think it's still an excellent RPG, it's a solid third-person shooter. It even had like the whole multiplayer thing, which I didn't really care for, but I didn't think it was absolutely awful or something. Playing through Mass Effect 3, I actually thought this was kind of the best Mass Effect. I mean, it has the best gameplay, it has a great story and characters. It really was just the end where I was like, you know, Mass Effect 2 kind of had better pacing and story, but for the most part, Mass Effect 3 is a great game that way too many people shafted or just threw out the window because the ending isn't good. There's more to the game than the ending. Sure, the conclusion is not what you wanted, it's not what I wanted, it's not really what anybody wanted, and after 3 games and all this build-up, yeah, it's a bit disappointing, but I'm not going to act like the rest of the game wasn't awesome. I still like the game, I still recommend it, especially if you played the first 2 games, and have honestly been wanting to replay it for quite some time, because I really did enjoy the game that much. And while I don't see as many negative takes on it as I did, say, 10 years ago, I still see quite a number of negative takes on it, and I'd still say it's a little overhated. Alright, with this one, I'm sure I'm going to ruffle some feathers, and I'm certain people are going to disagree with me on it, but this is just how I feel. I have the Resident Evil 3 remake. Now, I'll just immediately say, I love Resident Evil, I love the original Resident Evil 3, and this game is not as good as the original game, and it's not a very good remake. I mean, I feel like it's pretty rare, especially nowadays, when a remake of a game comes out and it's not better than the original game. I know there are some people that prefer the original RE2 and RE4 to the remakes, but most of the time, the remakes are definitively better than that original game. That is not the case with Resident Evil 3. Despite all of this, I still think the Resident Evil 3 remake is a good game. I've heard some people call this one of the worst Resident Evil games, one of the worst survival horror games in the last few years, and I wholeheartedly disagree on both of those. But look, I'm not going to say that this is a great game or one of the best Resident Evil games. I'm not going to gas it up or whatever the kids call it these days, glaze it up. Or maybe it's just glazing, I'm not sure. How do you do, fellow kids? Skibbity toilet. Anyway, to get back on track here, Resident Evil 3, it's not a great game, but I would still say it's a decent to good game. It is rather short, it is missing a decent amount of content from the original game, and it's nowhere near as replayable as the original game, but it's still a half-decent third-person shooter survival horror. I think what is in the game is still decently designed, even if the pacing does feel a bit rushed. I wish we could have seen more of Nemesis in like his normal form, but maybe that's a bit of a nitpick. I think the combat is still decent to good, the survival mechanics are good, the puzzles are still solid enough, the level design is good, there's still a good sense of exploration, and the game still has plenty of awesome set pieces and some pretty good bosses. Yes, it's missing things from the original game, it's not the most faithful remake, but looking at what we actually have versus what we don't have, I believe there is a decent game here. There's also a good amount of fan service, and the presentation is phenomenal. Like, this game looks absolutely incredible, and the sound design is great too. I'm not trying to sit here for 30 minutes defending the Resident Evil 3 remake. I don't think it's great, I think it's alright. But to call this game one of the very worst Resident Evil games, I think that's a bit silly. Go play like any of the spin-offs and you'll see that this game is better than pretty much all of them. And it certainly feels more cohesive. I'm not going to say this game's better though than like any of the modern Resident Evil games. RE2 remake, RE4 remake, 7 and 8 are much better than this game. And part of me feels like it's that those games are so good, it makes this game look worse than it actually is. That and this game kind of reuses assets from 2, but to be fair, the original game did as well. So I guess it is kind of faithful in that aspect. Anyway, I don't want to be here for 20 minutes. I'll just say this game is alright. It's not as bad as most people say it is. It's not a very good remake, but you still have a half-decent, short survival horror game. And hopefully I did not lose all subscribers from posting Cringe. We're just going to keep the hot takes rolling here, and speaking of rolling, we have Need for Speed Most Wanted 2012. Now, kind of similar to the RE3 remake, I don't think this game is as good as the original game with the same name. This game is not as good as Need for Speed Most Wanted 2005. And part of me really wonders why they decided to call it Need for Speed Most Wanted. There's basically no connection to that original game other than the blacklist showing up. I think if this game had a different name, the game would not be hated on anywhere near as much, because when you compare this to 2005, yeah, it's not even close. 2005 is a way better game. It has a good story, pacing, the racing's better, the map's better, etc., etc. But, like big fat juicy butt, if you don't compare this game to the original and look at it, you know, just by itself, I think it's actually one of the best Need for Speed games. And yes, I'm very, very, very aware that this is a hot take. I've had many people tell me down below that this game is awful and it's one of the worst Need for Speed games, but I disagree. I think this is actually a pretty good game. I think the open world is very well designed. I think the driving is actually really great. I love how the cars handle. It has that typical arcade, but not totally arcade feel, and it just has a really nice feel to it. I think the physics are good, and I think the racing in general is pretty solid, and then the map design makes it actually somewhat interesting. There's a bunch of little shortcuts and secrets. It's not as expansive as like Burnout Paradise, but I still think it's a good open world and it makes for a good backdrop for all the racing. When it comes to the game's progression, I know that this is seriously a point of contention. The fact that the progression is pretty different from literally like any other Need for Speed game. In most Need for Speeds, you start in a pretty slow car at the beginning, and as you play through the game, you get faster and faster cars. That makes sense. In Most Wanted 2012, you just find cars in the open world and you can drive with them pretty much whenever you want. So when you start the game, if you know where like the fastest cars in the game are, you can just have the fastest cars the entire game. And yeah, that absolutely can mess with the progression, especially if you just stick to 1 or 2 cars the whole game. I will say in my experience, I didn't know where all the fastest cars in the game were, so I got to try out a bunch of them and found out for myself which cars I liked and disliked. And I'm pretty sure that's the way the game is meant to be played, where you just explore around, try different cars, and experiment a little bit. And I thought the game absolutely excelled at that, and I thought it made the pacing pretty solid. The game doesn't have like a super long length to it either, but it was still an enjoyable time. And while the blacklist is not as unique or well implemented as that original game, I think it's still decently implemented here. It keeps things interesting and there's plenty of challenges. The Need for Speed community is pretty all over the place. There are some people that think the series should be like the older games. There are some people, actually there's a lot of people that think they should go back to the underground Most Wanted era. And then there are actually people who do like the current modern direction of Need for Speed. I like all three and have enjoyed seeing the series evolve. As someone who's played through all of the games, literally every Need for Speed, the series needed to evolve and change, and that's exactly what it's done time after time again. And I'm sure in a few years the series will be completely different again. What I'm trying to say is that the Need for Speed community is a fickle bunch, and I see a bunch of hate thrown at this game because it's not like the original Most Wanted, and it's like, no, it's not. It's a different kind of game, and I think it's still a good driving game. I think it's still worth playing, and it still has a fantastic soundtrack. Seriously, I love the soundtrack to this game so much. I actually really like this game, and it always makes me sad when I see people really dunking on it and calling it one of the worst Need for Speed games. I think that it's a good game. So for this entry, I don't have 1 game, 2 games, 10 games, no, I just have an entire franchise, and that franchise is Sonic the Hedgehog. At some point, nearly every Sonic game has been overhated, in my opinion. Outside of Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transform, Sonic Generations, and maybe Sonic 3 and Knuckles, really every Sonic game has gotten a ton of hate at some point. From the original few games of the 90s to pretty much all of the games in the 2000s, almost every spin-off, and then plenty of modern Sonic games as well. Like even here in 2024, there are people still dumping all over pretty much every Sonic game, and sometimes it is very well warranted. Sonic 06, Sonic Boom, Sonic Freeriders, Sonic Spinball, all of these are very well warranted, and yeah, I totally get why people hate these games because they're awful, but seeing people really hate on the Sonic Adventure games, Sonic Heroes, Sonic Unleashed, Sonic Lost World, and shoot, I've been seeing plenty of people hate on Sonic Frontiers, and I think all the games I just mentioned are good to great games. There is also Shadow the Hedgehog, that one is a little bit more warranted, but I have a really soft spot for that game, so I'm just not really going to talk about it here. But seriously, to see so many people hate on 3D Sonic games, and I just think it's totally unwarranted. Now, I'm not going to act like these are some of the greatest 3D platformers of all time. They all have flaws. Really, every Sonic game has some kind of flaw. Sonic Adventure, some of the characters suck. Sonic Adventure 2, actually, that one's pretty good. Sonic Heroes, the controls are whack and they want you to play through the game several times. Shadow the Hedgehog is perfect the way it is. Sonic Unleashed has the Werehog level. Sonic Lost World has some levels that really suck. And Sonic Frontiers at times can feel really empty. But I think that even with these issues, these are still pretty good games. I mean, a majority of Sonic Adventure is awesome. Sonic Heroes, yeah, playing through the game 4 times is pretty whack. Don't do that. Sonic Unleashed has some fantastic levels, and the Werehog really isn't that bad. Sonic Lost World has more good levels than bad ones, and Sonic Frontiers, I actually kind of like the open zones, and think the game has decent exploration, even with the floating rails, because newsflash, Sonic's always had floating rails. Sonic Heroes had floating rails almost 20 years earlier. I feel like people will take negative elements from Sonic games and just balloon them to such a ridiculous degree that the game's awful. Like, oh, the Werehog levels are unplayable, they're absolutely awful, they ruin the game. The Werehog was not that bad. Or another common one I'll hear is Big the Cat absolutely ruined Sonic Adventure. Playing as him is awful. You play as Big the Cat for like 3 or 4 levels. It's like an hour.
Seriously, I hate all you freaking Sonic haters!
Call it just my nostalgia getting the best of me, but I love pretty much all the games I just mentioned, and the hate doesn't end there. A lot of the spin-offs get a ton of hate as well. I feel like I've been seeing people dunk on Sonic Riders for almost 20 years, and I think it's just totally unwarranted. Sonic Riders absolutely has a steep learning curve. It does not make a lot of sense if you're jumping in totally blind, but if you give this game even a little bit of time, it will all click and you'll realize that there's actually a ton of depth with the original Sonic writers. Like, people have been speedrunning this and doing crazy time trials. Sonic Riders has so much depth that most people don't even find out about. And then people have just been dunking on Sonic R from the moment it was released. I remember watching a video back in the mid-2000s. It was Screw Attack and Stuttering Craig and all of them, and they really said Sonic R is the worst Sonic game of all time. What on earth are you talking about, man?
Sonic is not a bad franchise anymore!
Like, Sonic R is not a great game, but it's not the worst Sonic game ever. There are so many worse Sonic games. Sonic Labyrinth, Sonic Spinball, any of the Game Gear games. There are way worse Sonic games, and what I'm trying to say with all of this is that Sonic's not actually that bad.
We have all these freaking hypocrites criticizing Sonic for the littlest of reasons!
Okay, at the risk of sounding any more cringe than I already have, I'll just say that Sonic actually has a pretty decent track record with games. People act like there hasn't been a good Sonic game since the Genesis, or that Sonic was just never good to begin with, and that's just simply not true. There's plenty of great Sonic games, and I think most Sonic games are honestly overhated. And so our next game is Batman Arkham Origins. Now, you might be saying this one really isn't that overhated. I certainly think it's still overhated. I mean, even Warner Brothers themselves don't really seem to talk about it. They've re-released every Arkham game except for Arkham Origins. Even the kinda crummy 3DS game got a re-release, but not Arkham Origins, and that's a real shame. I will say that, like I've said plenty of times in this video, it's not as good as other games in the series. I'd rather play Arkham Asylum, Arkham City, and Arkham Knight, but does that make Arkham Origins a bad game? No. I think that this is actually a pretty good game, and I don't think we realized just how good we had it when this game came out. I mean, this came out when Batman games were absolutely at their peak, and so with it being not as good as Arkham City or Knight, people just kind of forgot about it and went, oh yeah, that one's not very good. But trust me, if you come back to this game nowadays, you'll quickly realize that it's way better than you might actually remember. Sure, some of the voice actors are different and it does sound a little weird, and the plot isn't great. I don't love the direction the story takes. I won't spoil it because there's probably a few people that still haven't played it, but I will say the twist in the ending, yeah, I'm not huge on it, but I think the gameplay is more than solid enough. It does actually bring its own additions to the table from Arkham City, like much more thorough investigations, which Arkham Knight would end up taking from. The combat really is just as good as it was in Arkham City. The open world, yeah, it's not as good as Arkham City, and it is a bit lifeless for being Gotham, but I think it's still well designed. There's plenty of great side content, and the bosses are really great in this game. Like, the fight with Deathstroke is actually really great. It's one of the best boss fights in the whole series. Sure, it's at the beginning of the game, but I thought it was really great. When you fight Firefly, it's great. There's no Batmobile here. And I think the game is incredibly replayable. It has a good pace to it. It doesn't have a super long length. I've replayed through the game and I loved it. I tried to find like all the Riddler trophies just like I did for Arkham Asylum, Arkham Knight, and Arkham City. Yes, the game is not by Rocksteady. It has a bit of a different tone, and when you line up all four games together, it absolutely is the odd one out. Does that mean it should be totally forgotten and dumped on like I've seen? No, absolutely not. Like, we did not realize just how good we had it. Yes, the multiplayer is dog crap in this game, but I would much rather play Arkham Origins over Gotham Knights, over Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. Like, this game is more fun and it just has more going for it in my opinion. I remember when it came out, it did have a lot of glitches and a lot of people were kind of dunking on the presentation, and yeah, it doesn't look amazing for the time and there was a few bugs, but it wasn't game-breaking stuff, not to the point where I'd say the game was bad or even close to bad. I really just don't get why Warner Brothers hasn't re-released this one. It seems like it would be pretty obvious to re-release with the other Arkham games, but no, they just really haven't. Regardless though, if you're a fan of the Batman Arkham games like at all, I totally think this game is worth playing. Don't listen to all the people online going, this game sucks, there's a reason Warner Brothers won't re-release it, it's not worth playing. I think it's a good game. I think you should try it, form your own opinion, go from there. I think this game's been overhated for quite a while, and I'm here to say Arkham Origins is good. Alright, we're almost done here, but our next entry is a double whammy. It is Paper Mario Color Splash and Origami King. Now, the Paper Mario community is obviously very divided and incredibly vocal about their opinion, plenty of people don't want to play a Paper Mario game that is nothing like the Thousand Year Door. I'll be the first to admit, I love the Thousand Year Door. I love the original game on 64, but the Thousand Year Door is the best Paper Mario in my opinion, and it may be the best Mario RPG of them all. The game's been gassed up for 20 years, and we all know it's the GOAT, except Nintendo, I guess, because they don't want to make another Paper Mario game like the Thousand Year Door. Sure, they re-released the Thousand Year Door, but we still don't have another game like the Thousand Year Door. There's never been any real kind of follow-up. We had Super Paper Mario, then we had Sticker Star, Color Splash, Origami King, and none of these are like the Thousand Year Door. And people online have been very vocal about wanting Paper Mario to return to its roots and be like the Thousand Year Door. So when it's not like it, well, they just immediately hate on it and say it's awful. And yeah, it's not like the Thousand Year Door. These games are not as good as the Thousand Year Door, but outside of Sticker Star, I think Paper Mario is a pretty great series. I think Color Splash and Origami King are actually quite good. And if you like Paper Mario or RPGs, I think you can like these games. Yeah, they're different from the Thousand Year Door and the original. The turn-based combat is totally different. The combat is not as good. There's not as many wacky characters, and it doesn't get as weird or all over the place as the original and Door gets, but I still think they absolutely have their own merits. The writing is still really good. The story, for the most part, is still pretty good. The presentation is just absolutely fantastic for both games. The combat, yeah, while it's not great, I think it's decent enough. The boss fights at least are pretty good. Like when you fight the real life objects, I actually think this is pretty good. And at the end of the day, I think they're both enjoyable experiences that a lot of people didn't give the time of day because it's not like the older ones. And all I gotta say is, try the games for yourself. Just go in with an open mind. Don't keep comparing it to the older ones. It's clear Nintendo doesn't want to make one like the older ones at this time, and see how you like it. I feel like most people that don't like Origami King or Color Splash didn't actually play it. They're just Paper Mario fans who only want it to be like the old games, and while I totally want them to return to the style of the old games, I'm not going to ignore what we have here. If you're looking for a game that's a real follow-up to the Thousand Year Door, you can play Bug Fables, which is low-key better than the Thousand Year Door in certain aspects, but for everyone else, I think you should try Origami King and Color Splash. You can enjoy them for what they are. Instead of focusing on what they aren't, focus on what they actually are. They're good experiences that are worth your time. Man, I sound like a freaking pirate out here. RRR. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is Origami King, Color Splash, they're good games. They're not as good as Thousand Year Door. It's not like Thousand Year Door. How many times am I going to compare it to the freaking Door? Too many times. They're good. They're worth playing. They're overhated. The end. But it's not actually the end. I have one more game for you, and that is Fallout 4. Now, I love the Fallout series. I think Fallout 4 is a great game, but if you go online, you'll see that there are a lot of people that really hate Fallout 4. And while I'm not going to say Fallout 4 is the most overhated game of all time, I still think it is a little overhated. The meme is always that Fallout 4 is a great game if you don't have someone whispering in your ear that New Vegas is better. And yeah, that actually is pretty true. Look, New Vegas is a fantastic game. It's like the fan favorite when it comes to the Fallout games. Most people would say New Vegas is their favorite. Most people would say New Vegas is the best one. That doesn't discount the other games. I feel like I've talked about this the whole video. Just because another game in the same series is better than this doesn't mean this game is horrible or not worth playing. It very much is worth playing. Fallout 4 has so much good to it that it's not even funny. Yeah, the dialogue system is not very good. The karma system is non-existent, but do these absolutely ruin the game like some people online will have you believe? No, not at all. This game has so much good to it. No, not at all. It is very easy to overlook that there's no karma and that the dialogue system's just not very good. It's not game breaking by any means. What about all the stuff this game actually gets right? I think the open world is great. It's one of the best open worlds to any of Bethesda's games. I think there are so many great memorable side quests. The companions are excellent. They have some really great personalities. They're incredibly likable, and I really love the stories for all of the companions. The main story, yeah, it absolutely has its issues, especially towards the end, but I think most of it is pretty good. The initial premise is great. It sadly just fizzles out by the end of it. I think the combat is good though. The RPG mechanics, again, without the karma system and the dialogue intact, I think it's still pretty decent. And then the game looks half decent. Honestly, it kind of looks better than 76. 76 is a game that absolutely deserves the hate in my opinion as someone who's played it actually very recently. But this video is not on 76, it's on Fallout 4. I believe this game has been overhated from the moment it was released. I've seen people just absolutely tear this game apart, say it's nowhere near as good as the old Fallout games, it's a waste of time, don't play it. I completely disagree. I like old Fallout. Those older games are great, but I also like new Fallout. They're different, but I think they're actually still good and absolutely worth playing. Well, Fallout 4 is absolutely worth playing for the reasons I already mentioned. Let's wrap things up. This video is getting pretty long. Every game has flaws. Even the very best of video games have issues, have negatives, have cons, have something that people are going to have a gripe with. And not everyone's going to like everything. These are just a few games that I believe too many people have been dunking on. It's why I believe that they're overhated. They don't deserve all of the hate they get. Most of these games are actually good games. I'm sure you didn't agree with me for this entire video, so let me know down below where you disagree with me, or maybe you actually did agree with me completely. In that case, well, I didn't expect that. Hopefully this video was not just an entire incoherent mess and I actually made some good points, or maybe I just have no idea what I'm talking about. Either way, I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to this part of the video, comment Christmas. We're getting closer and closer to Christmas. I can just feel it. Absolutely feel it. You comment that, you're going to get a heart from me. Hope you all have an excellent day, weekend, night, whatever it is. See you later. Bye-bye.